Ella Carter stood at the center of the school stage, both hands locked around the microphone, her eyes scanning the rows of seats below where the whispering had already begun. She could not hear the laughter clearly, but she could read it. The upturned corners of mouths, the sideways glances, the shoulders shaking with amusement, and she could see her father's face burning red at the far end of the auditorium. The music track began, and Ella missed the entrance by half a beat, her voice sliding in just a fraction too late. The laughter spread through the rows like a crack running through glass, slow at first, and then impossible to stop. Then, in the third row, a quiet man nobody had noticed stood up from his seat, raised both hands into the air, and began signing the words of the song directly to her. He did not look around for approval. He simply looked at Ella. Keep watching, because Logan's small act of courage is about to change everything Ella Carter ever believed about herself. Ella Carter had been deaf since the age of 2. She had not been born into silence exactly. Sound still reached her, but it arrived distorted, fragmented, like a radio signal drifting in and out of range between mountains. By the time she turned 12, she had built an entire vocabulary of sensation to replace what her ears could not reliably deliver. She had learned to read lips with the concentration of someone deciphering a foreign language in real time, to feel rhythm through the vibration that climbed up through her shoes when music played in a room, and to track emotion in the faces of the people speaking around her with a precision that most hearing people never developed. Ella had learned, in her own quiet way, to translate the world. What surprised people most about Ella, and sometimes irritated them, though they rarely admitted it, was that she loved music. Not in an abstract or sentimental way, but with a deep, almost fierce devotion that made strangers uncomfortable because they could not understand where it came from. Some of the kids at Millbrook Middle School had said, not always quietly, that it made no sense for a girl who could barely hear to spend her afternoons in the music room. Ella paid those remarks very little attention. To her, music was not a thing confined to what the ears could receive. She experienced it in the vibration of the upright piano in the corner of the rehearsal room when she pressed her palms flat against its wooden body, in the way a strong bass note traveled through the floor and into her knees when the sound system in the gym was turned up high, in the visible tension of a performer's jaw and the movement of their throat when they pushed into a high note. Music, for Ella, lived in the body long before it reached the ears. Her father, David Carter, was a quiet man who worked as a shift supervisor at a packaging facility on the edge of town. He was a man of routine and caution, someone who had learned early in life that the world was quicker to hurt you than to lift you up, and he had carried that lesson with him into fatherhood. He loved Ella with the kind of love that expressed itself through worry, rather than celebration, packing her lunch with careful notes, walking her to the school entrance even when she insisted she was old enough to go alone, calling the school ahead of every field trip to ask whether accommodations were in place. His love was sincere and constant, but it was a love that sometimes mistook shelter for support, and David had spent most of Ella's childhood quietly steering her away from situations where she might be exposed to pain. When Ella came home one afternoon and announced she had signed up for the school talent showcase, David had smiled and said he was proud of her. But that same evening, alone in the kitchen, he had stood over the sink for a long time, staring at the water running from the faucet, trying to talk himself out of a cold, settling dread he could not name. Charlotte Hayes was the music teacher at Millbrook, a woman in her mid-40s who wore long cardigans and had a habit of conducting along to whatever played in her head while walking between classrooms. She was not unkind to Ella, that would be an unfair characterization, but she was uncertain. When Ella had come to her classroom to tell her she planned to sing in the showcase, Charlotte had asked a series of careful, hedging questions about whether Ella had attempted something like this before, whether she had support in place, whether she fully understood how the format worked. Ella had answered each question with the same patient steadiness, explaining that she had been practicing for several weeks, that she had memorized the song's rhythm through vibration, and that she had the words committed to memory well enough to deliver them. Charlotte had nodded along and told her the stage was open to every student, but she had not stopped worrying, And on the morning of the showcase, she had arrived early to ask the sound technician to watch for cues in case something went wrong. Something in Charlotte's gut told her the afternoon might be more complicated than it looked. Madison Reed was 12 years old and had understood from an early age that social survival at Millbrook depended on being noticed and on making sure certain other people were not. She was not cruel in any calculated way. She was simply careless with other people's dignity in the way that some 12-year-olds are when they have never been made to examine the cost of their casual cruelties. She had been making comments about Ella's voice for most of the semester, low enough to be deniable, loud enough to reach the right ears. The week before the showcase, when Ella passed Madison's table in the cafeteria, Madison had said, with the particular brand of false sweetness that middle schoolers learn to weaponize, that she hoped Ella's performance went well. The girls seated around her had understood exactly what was meant by that, and they had smiled into their trays. On the evening before the showcase, Ella stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the house she shared with her father and practiced the song 12 times without stopping. She watched the shape of her own mouth forming each word, checking her lip movements against the muscle memory she had built over weeks of repetition. David stood outside the door for a while, listening through the thin wood to the sound of his daughter's voice coming through muffled and imperfect, and he pressed his hand flat against the doorframe and let himself cry quietly so that Ella would not feel the vibration of a footstep and know he was there. He was not crying because he thought she would fail. He was crying because the world was big and loud and often thoughtless, and his daughter, who could not hear it the way others did, had chosen to stand in the middle of it anyway. Logan Bennett was 34 years old, and he had driven to Millbrook Middle School that afternoon, not as a parent and not as a teacher, but as what the invitation had called a community arts supporter, a former student of the district whose modest annual contribution to the school's arts fund had earned him a seat on the guest list for the showcase. He had almost not come. He had stood in the parking lot of his apartment building for several minutes, with the printed invitation in his hand, telling himself it would be a short event, just an hour or two, a handful of kids playing instruments badly and singing off-key while their parents applauded as though greatness was being witnessed. He was not a man who sought out large rooms full of other people's emotions anymore. He had learned to keep his days quiet and contained. But he had come anyway, parking in the back row of the school lot and walking into the auditorium with the specific intention of sitting near an exit. Logan had a daughter once. Her name was Mia Bennett, and she had been born into a world that she experienced through her hands and her eyes and the soles of her feet, the same way Ella Carter did, though Logan had not known Ella Carter then. Mia had been born with profound bilateral hearing loss, diagnosed at 4 months, and the years that followed her diagnosis had been years in which Logan had remade himself around her needs with the kind of quiet, methodical devotion that goes largely unnoticed because it asks for nothing. He had learned American Sign Language not through a class or a program, though he had eventually attended both, but through Mia herself following her hands, asking her to slow down, making her laugh at his mistakes until the mistakes stopped and the language became second nature. He had signed bedtime stories to her. He had signed the words to songs she loved while she pressed her small palms against the speakers of the living room stereo. He had signed the words to her first favorite song so many times that the movements lived in his hands the way a prayer lives in the hands of someone who has said it every day for years. Mia had died on a Tuesday in March. 4 years before the afternoon Logan sat down in the third row of the Millbrook Auditorium. The accident had been ordinary in its tragedy. A car, a wet intersection, a moment that closed everything. Logan had not signed to anyone since the morning of her funeral, when he had stood at the front of a small chapel and signed the words to a song as he spoke them aloud, because Mia's teacher from the school for the deaf had been there and he had wanted her to hear it in the language Mia loved. After that day, his hands had gone quiet. On the few occasions when the muscle memory surfaced when he was driving, and his left hand unconsciously formed the sign for a word he had heard on the radio, or when he reached out to a child in a store and nearly signed before catching himself, he would press his hands flat against his thighs and wait for the reflex to pass. The language felt too much like the wound. He had learned not to touch it. Logan settled into the third row of the auditorium and glanced at the program without really reading it. He scanned the stage out of habit, the blue curtain backdrop, the standing microphone, the folding chairs arranged for the small orchestra that would accompany the first act. He watched a boy in an ill-fitting blazer play a competent but earnest piece on violin, and he clapped when others clapped, and thought about whether the drive home would be better on the surface streets or the highway. Then the MC, a cheerful assistant principal named Mr. Gallagher, stepped to the microphone and introduced the next performer as a very special young lady who would be performing a very special number, and Logan felt a quiet irritation rise in his chest at the word special, used twice in the same breath, the way adults used it, when they wanted to signal to a room that what they were about to witness required a different kind of expectation. He had heard that particular use of the word applied to Mia more times than he could count, and it had never sat right with him. It was the word people used when they were preparing an audience for something they did not fully believe in. Ella Carter walked onto the stage in a pale blue dress that David had bought for the occasion at a department store downtown, standing in the dress section for 20 minutes, trying to identify the right one, finally choosing the blue because he remembered that Ella had once pointed to a picture in a magazine and traced the color with her finger. She stepped to the microphone and gripped it with both hands, a habit she had developed because the slight vibration of the stand gave her a reference point when the music began. The auditorium was only 3/4 full, but to Ella, it looked enormous from the stage, a mass of faces blurring together under the fluorescent brightness of the house lights, all of them angled toward her, in the particular way that told her they were watching and waiting. She tried to find Charlotte in the wings, but the stage lights were cutting her line of sight. She tried to find her father and thought she could see the shape of him near the back wall. She pressed her lips together, took a slow breath, and waited for the music track to begin. The opening bars of the song came through the monitors in the floor of the stage, and Ella felt the rhythm through the soles of her dress shoes, a steady 4-count pulse that she had memorized with her feet during every practice session in the school hallway. She had planned to count herself in from the vibration and enter on the 5th beat, but the stage monitors were positioned differently than the hallway speakers, and the vibration pattern was slightly off, not by much, but enough to throw her internal count by a half beat. She came in a half-second late, her voice landing on the first word of the lyric just after the pitch had already implied where it should have been. A small sound moved through the front section of the student seats. A short, suppressed burst, the kind of noise a crowd makes when it has witnessed something they were already expecting. Ella pushed through the first phrase and arrived at the second, but the missed entrance had unsettled her sense of the track's position, and she came in early on the second phrase, overcompensating, her voice landing slightly ahead of the melody line. The laughter in the student section grew louder, no longer suppressed. She could not hear it the way others heard it, but she could see it everywhere. Shoulders bouncing, hands over mouths, faces turning to neighbors in that specific shared delight that comes when someone confirms the thing you already thought would happen. David was on his feet before he knew he had stood up. He was at the back of the auditorium, one hand already reaching forward as though he could cross 100 feet of folding chairs and fixed seats between himself and the stage by will alone. He stopped because Ella was still holding the microphone. She had not let go, had not turned to walk off, had not dropped her chin to her chest. She was standing there in the pale blue dress, with the stage lights washing out her expression, and she was holding on. He understood that if he walked down that aisle and pulled her off the stage, it would confirm every protective instinct he had ever acted on, and it would tell her, in the clearest possible language, that her father did not believe she could get through it. He stood with his hand half raised and did nothing. Madison Reed was 2 rows from the front, and she was laughing. She had not planned to laugh, exactly, or perhaps she had, and had not admitted it to herself. Either way, she was laughing, and the 2 girls beside her were laughing, and the sound was traveling and multiplying the way these things do, in rooms full of young people who have not yet learned that laughter at someone's expense always costs more than it feels like in the moment. Ella could not hear them with her ears, But she saw Madison's face clearly, and something in her chest pulled tight and downward at the same time. Logan was watching from the third row. He had stopped thinking about the drive home. He had been watching Ella since she walked out from the wings, not because he had planned to, but because something in the way she moved registered to him at a frequency that had nothing to do with conscious thought. The grip on the microphone stand, the way her eyes were scanning rather than landing, the precise tilt of her chin that told him she was reading surfaces rather than hearing them. He had seen all of it before. He had seen it in the girl he had spent 7 years learning to communicate with, in every room they had ever entered together, in every performance, in every grocery store, and every school event where Mia had navigated the hearing world with the same careful, quiet watchfulness. When the laughter broke from the student section and Ella began to lose the thread of the song, Logan felt something move in his chest. That was not grief exactly, though it was very close to grief. It was the particular ache of recognizing someone's struggle from the inside. His hands moved before the decision reached his brain. He was on his feet. He did not look around to see whether anyone was watching. He raised both hands to chest height and began to sign the first line of the song, clear and slow and precise, shaped for someone reading from a distance, the way he had shaped his signs for Mia when she was young and learning, when the distance between the couch and the kitchen was still too great for the smaller movements. He held steady in the third row, arms up, looking directly at Ella, not performing for the room but speaking to one person through the only language that made complete sense in that moment. And he waited for her to look up. Ella saw him. She was mid-phrase, already drifting, already feeling the familiar pull of panic that came when the sound refused to organize itself around her. And then she saw a man in the third row, standing with his hands raised and moving. She did not register who he was. She registered only that someone was signing, and that the signs matched the words she was supposed to be saying, and that the movements were directed at her with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with spectacle. She locked onto his hands the way a navigator locks onto a fixed point on the horizon when the water is rough. Logan signed the next phrase before she got there. She breathed in and followed him into it. Her voice steadied. Not perfectly, there was still a quiver in it, still the slight roughness of adrenaline, but it was there, and it was hers, and it was on the beat. The laughter in the student section did not stop all at once. It faded unevenly, in the way that attention shifts when something in the room changes tone. First, the people nearest the third row noticed the man standing with his hands up. Then the people around them followed their eye line. Then the rows behind caught the quiet that was spreading forward, and they looked up to see what had changed on the stage, and they found Ella singing, not failing, but singing with her eyes fixed on something in the auditorium below her. A different kind of attention replaced the laughter. It was not silence, exactly. It was the quality of air in a room, when everyone in it has decided without discussion to stop and pay attention to something unexpected. Charlotte Hayes was standing in the stage left wing with her hands clasped and her knuckles white. She had already turned to find the sound technician, already rehearsed in her head what she was going to say when she signaled to cut the track and bring Ella off. Then she heard Ella's voice change. She heard the tremor in it steady and the pitch settle, and she looked out from the wing and saw a man in the third row signing with the economy and fluency of someone for whom the language had been lived rather than learned. Charlotte was not fluent in American Sign Language. She knew enough to recognize expertise when she saw it. She stood very still in the wing and watched, and something she had been carrying in her chest since the morning, a low-grade guilt about the questions she had asked Ella, about the measured doubt behind her measured support, began to loosen. David was still standing at the back of the auditorium, both hands now pressed flat against the seat back in front of him. He could see the man in the third row, and he could see Ella's face, and he could see the precise moment when his daughter found her footing. He had spent 12 years watching Ella navigate a world that was not built for the way she experienced it. He had watched her red lips across cafeteria tables and press her palms to walls to feel sound and decode 1,000 situations through observation alone. And he had always carried alongside his love for her a quiet, aching awareness of how much harder she had to work for things that other people simply received. But this moment was different. Watching a stranger raise his hands without being asked, without reward, without anything at stake, except Ella's ability to finish what she had started, David felt something move in him that was too large and too sudden to be named. His throat closed and his eyes went wet, and he pressed his palms harder against the seat back and did not try to speak. Logan's hands moved through the song from muscle memory, the same way hands move through prayers and lullabies and all the repeated gestures of love. He had not planned this. He had not arrived at Millbrook Middle School that afternoon with any intention beyond sitting through an hour of amateur performances and driving home to a quiet apartment. But the song was one he had signed 100 times in a living room years ago, one he could have signed in his sleep. And Ella's eyes were on him with the complete, concentrated trust of someone who has found a handhold at the edge of a cliff. And so he signed it. He signed it the same way he had signed it for Mia, not as performance, but as conversation. And somewhere around the second verse, when Ella's voice lifted slightly above the trembling that had characterized the early phrases and took on something that might have been called confidence, Logan noticed that his jaw was clenched, and that his eyes were stinging, and that he was, for the first time in a very long time, doing the thing his hands had been built to do. Ella reached the bridge of the song, the section she had most feared, where the melody climbed and the phrasing stretched out, and Logan signed it ahead of her, anchoring each line in the air before she reached it. She followed every phrase. She was not singing perfectly by any conventional measure. There were notes slightly flat, moments where her breath ran short, and she pushed through on sheer momentum. But there was something in the imperfect, forward-moving quality of it that had the auditorium holding very still in the way that rooms do when something true is happening in them. When she reached the final chorus, Ella stopped reading Logan's hands for a moment and simply sang. She knew the words. She had always known the words. What she had needed was something to fix her to the rhythm, to stop the drift that panic created. And once that anchor, at the last note, she held it as long as her breath allowed, and then let it go, and stood with both hands at her sides, and the microphone still loosely gripped. The applause came up slowly, and then all at once, the way it does when an audience is not sure what they witnessed until they are absolutely sure. Ella could not hear it as a clear sound, but she felt. It felt the particular vibration through the stage floor that told her the floor itself was reacting to the impact of many hands, felt it travel up through her shoes and into her shins. She placed one hand over her sternum, the way she always did when she wanted to feel her own heartbeat, and she found it there, rapid and steady and real. Then she looked at Logan, who was still standing in the third row with his hands at his sides now, and she gave him the smallest nod she had. He nodded back. After the showcase ended and the folding chairs began emptying and parents gathered their children at the front of the auditorium, Ella came down from the stage and moved not toward her father but toward the third row. David watched her go without trying to intercept. He followed at a distance. Ella stopped in front of Logan and looked at him, and then she raised her hands and signed a question. "You know that song?" Logan's throat tightened. He nodded and signed back that he had known it for a long time, that he had sung it, signed it to his daughter many years ago. Ella's expression shifted in the small, precise way that it always did when she was tracking something carefully. She signed, "Where is she?" Logan was quiet for a moment. Then he signed, slowly, that she was not here anymore, not in this world. Ella looked at him with the particular directness that came from a lifetime of reading faces for information that others expressed in volume and tone, and she signed, "She must have loved you very much." Logan felt the words arrive in his chest before his mind had finished processing the syntax of them. He had spent 4 years holding the weight of Mia's absence. He had thought of that weight almost exclusively in terms of loss, what he no longer had, what he could no longer do, the silence where her voice and her hands had been. He had not thought of it, in a long time, as evidence of how much there had been before the silence. David reached them and extended his hand to Logan. He said thank you in the simplest and most direct way, without the hedging qualifications that men sometimes use to avoid the full weight of what they mean. Logan shook his hand. David then turned to Ella and signed imperfectly, with the deliberate concentration of a man who had learned just enough to mean it that he was proud of her and that he was sorry for the ways he had tried to protect her by keeping her small. Ella did not cry. She looked at her father with the same steady attention she had given Logan, and she signed back that she did not blame him, but that she needed him to understand something. She did not want to be sheltered from the world. She wanted to live in it. She wanted to sing in it, to be wrong in it, to fall down in it, and get back up the same as anyone else. David nodded. He was crying. He nodded anyway. Charlotte Hayes came to find them near the auditorium door. She apologized to Ella, with the directness of someone who had been preparing the words since the moment in the wing when she realized how insufficient her earlier doubts had been. She told Ella that she had been wrong to hedge, that the stage was Ella's right, and not a privilege to be carefully extended, and that she intended to speak with the school's administration about building proper support for hearing-impaired students into every arts program the school offered. Ella accepted the apology with a quiet gravity that Charlotte found more humbling than anger would have been. Madison Reed stood 20 feet away the entire time, close enough to hear, not close enough to be part of the circle. She did not come forward that evening, but she did not leave either. Before they parted ways at the auditorium door, Logan told David and Ella that if Ella was interested, he would be glad to help her prepare for the citywide competition that was coming up in the spring, not to manage her performance, but to build what he called a sign map for the song, a framework of signs that would anchor each phrase and each emotional transition so that she could carry it in her body rather than in her ears alone. David looked at Ella. Ella did not hesitate. Logan began meeting Ella at the school's music room on Tuesday afternoons. He did not teach her to sing differently. He helped her build a sign map for each song she was preparing, a system in which every musical phrase had a corresponding series of signs that she could use as a physical anchor, giving her body a language to move through the music even when the audio signal arrived to her distorted or incomplete. Ella was a fast learner, which did not surprise Logan, who had learned from Mia that children who develop extraordinary coping strategies in one domain tend to be quick studies in adjacent ones. Within 3 weeks, she was navigating the songs with a fluency that had less to do with following his hands and more to do with having internalized the structure he had helped her build. David came to several of the Tuesday sessions and asked to participate. He was awkward and slow, and made errors that required correction 3 or 4 times before they stuck, and on one occasion he produced a sign so far from the intended word that Ella laughed so hard she had to set down the sheet music she was holding. David turned red, and then laughed too, and Logan, watching the two of them, felt something shift quietly in his chest. He had spent the last 4 years believing that his competence in sign language was a monument to a specific person, something that belonged exclusively to Mia and therefore could not be shared without betrayal. Watching David fumble through a sign, watching Ella correct him with patient exasperation, watching the space between father and daughter close, in the particular way it closes when 2 people are working at something difficult together, Logan understood something he had resisted for a long time. The language was not a monument. It was a living thing. It stayed alive by being used. Charlotte restructured the music room schedule to add a weekly open practice that several students attended. She invited a small group to observe one of Ella's sessions, framing it not as a spectacle, but as a lesson in how to be a good audience for a different kind of performer. Madison came to the first open session and sat at the back of the room without speaking. Near the end of the hour, she raised her hand and asked Logan if she could learn the sign for the chorus of the song Ella was practicing. Logan looked at Ella. Ella gave a small nod. Logan showed Madison the signs, and Madison practiced them with the self-consciousness of someone who was aware that they owed a debt and was trying to begin paying it in small denominations. After the session, she approached Ella and apologized. Not quickly. Not with the hedging language of someone trying to minimize what they had done. She said that she had laughed on the day of the showcase because Ella frightened her, because the particular kind of courage Ella possessed was the kind that exposed, by contrast, how little courage Madison required of herself. She said she was ashamed of that, and that she understood if Ella did not want to forgive her. Ella told her that forgiveness was something to be earned through choices made going forward, and that right now what she needed from Madison was not sentiment, but action. Madison asked what she could do. Ella told her. In the weeks before the citywide competition, Madison worked with the school's stage crew to redesign the lighting rig for Ella's segment, positioning the key lights so that they illuminated the area of the auditorium below the stage, rather than washing out Ella's sightlines. She coordinated with Charlotte to identify the optimal position for Logan's viewing spot at the new venue, and then measured the angles herself, standing in the empty auditorium on a Thursday afternoon with a tape measure and a flashlight, making sure the geometry worked. She said nothing about this to Ella until the evening before the competition, when she showed Ella a diagram she had drawn and told her that the third row of the new venue had a clear sightline from the stage and that the lighting was confirmed. Ella looked at the diagram for a long time. Then she said, quietly, that Madison had done good work. Madison went home that evening and cried in her room, in the way that people cry when something they have done finally begins to match the person they want to be. The morning of the citywide competition, David pressed his palms together, looked at Ella across the kitchen table, and signed with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been practicing the phrase every day for 2 weeks. Today, I am proud of you. Every word correct. Ella looked at his hands and then at his face, and she smiled in the particular way she smiled when something surprised her into happiness. At the venue, Logan arrived early and found his seat in the third row. He sat down and folded his hands in his lap and waited. About 30 minutes before Ella's scheduled appearance, his phone vibrated in his pocket, and he looked at the screen and saw that it was a call from the Children's Hospital where Mia had received her audiological care. He stepped into the hallway and answered, and the woman on the line told him that during a wing renovation they had uncovered a small storage locker that had been sealed and overlooked, and that inside it was a box of personal items belonging to Mia that had never been claimed. She read him a partial inventory, a drawing, a journal, a small woven bracelet. Logan stood in the hallway outside the competition auditorium and felt the past come through him the way cold water comes through a seam. Not all at once, but steady and insistent and impossible to stop with any effort of will. He stood with the phone to his ear until the woman finished speaking, and then he said he would be in touch to arrange a pickup, and he ended the call, and he stood there for a long time with his back against the cinder block wall and his hands pressed flat against his thighs. The ache that moved through him was not grief, exactly though grief was part of it. It was something more complicated. The sensation of a door being opened into a room he had sealed because he believed he was not strong enough to enter it, and finding, standing in the doorway, that the room was not what he had been afraid of. It was full of Mia. Not the Mia of the accident, not the wound, but the living one, the girl who pressed her fingers to speakers, who laughed at his signing mistakes, who once fell asleep in the backseat of the car, with her hand still moving through the signs of a song she was rehearsing in her dream. Ella found him in the hallway. She had been looking for him before going to the warm-up room, and had asked Charlotte, who had pointed toward the hall. She came and stood in front of him and looked at his face for a moment, and then signed. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. She nodded, and signed back that she did not need him to be okay. She needed him to be there, the same as he had been in the third row, just present, just himself. Logan looked at her. He thought about what it meant to give someone a language they could not get from the world, and then they walked back through the lobby, toward the auditorium together. David intercepted them near the stage entrance. He had seen Logan's face, and he did not ask questions, but he put his hand briefly on Logan's shoulder and said, in the simplest way, that whatever was happening, he was glad Logan was there. Then he turned to Ella, and without rehearsal, without looking down at his hands, he signed the same phrase he had signed at the kitchen table that morning, every word correct. Ella put both arms around her father's shoulders. briefly, tightly, the way children hold their parents when they want them to understand something that doesn't require words in any language. Ella walked out onto the stage of the citywide auditorium in a plain white dress, and the house lights came down, and the stage lights came up positioned because of Madison's careful work, in a way that did not blind her sightlines below the fourth row. She found the third row. She found Logan. He raised his hands. She nodded and placed her feet apart slightly. The way she had learned to do so, she could feel the floor monitor's vibration more clearly, and she waited for the music to begin. The opening of the song arrived in the floor, and she counted into it with her feet and entered the first phrase cleanly, on the beat, no drift. Logan signed it as she sang it, not ahead of her now, but with her, the two of them moving through the phrases together the way people move through a familiar road, each of them knowing the turns, neither of them needing to lead. Her voice had changed since the school showcase. Not technically, not in any way that a judge with a rubric would necessarily identify, but in the way that voices change when the person using them has stopped apologizing for their presence. She sang through the first verse and into the second, and the auditorium was very quiet in the particular way of a room that has decided to give something its full attention. Midway through the bridge, Logan paused for a beat. It was brief, just the space of one sign, but Ella saw it, and in that pause, she understood what it cost him to be there, holding her to a song he had first signed in a living room for a girl who was not here anymore. She did not panic. Instead, with the microphone in her right hand, she lifted her left hand and signed the next phrase herself. Not perfectly, the sign for one of the words was slightly inexact, but clearly, unmistakably, in the same language that he had given her, that Mia had given him, that he had brought forward and placed into her hands without any expectation of return. Logan saw her left hand moving. He made a sound in his throat that was not audible to anyone more than 2 feet away. He blinked, and then his hands moved again, and they finished the bridge together. David was standing to the left of the stage entrance, and when he saw Ella's hand rise with the sign, he began to cry without any attempt to conceal it. Charlotte, watching from the wing, pressed her fingers over her mouth. Madison, in the lighting booth at the back of the hall, looked at the stage through the glass and felt something she would carry forward for many years, without quite having a name for it. The feeling of having contributed something small but real to a moment that was larger than yourself. As Ella reached the final chorus, a remarkable thing happened in the auditorium. David, who had been practicing for weeks, began to sign the words from beside the stage entrance. Charlotte, who had learned a handful of signs in the days before the competition, signed 3 of them from the wing. Several students from Ella's school, seated in the 4th and 5th rows, had learned the chorus from a practice session the week before, and they raised their hands. 4 of them signed. Then 6, not perfectly, not all in unison, but together, hands moving in the space between the stage and the seats, a small and imperfect choir of people who had decided to speak the language of the girl standing under the lights. Ella looked down from the stage and saw the hands. Not one, set many. She felt the floor vibrating under her feet, and she saw the hands moving, and she sang the final chorus with everything she had, not perfectly by any conventional measure, but truly, which is a different and more durable thing. When the last note ended, the auditorium stood. Ella stood with her hands at her sides and her chin up, and waited for the vibration to reach her through the floor, and when it came, she felt it the way she felt all music, not through her ears, but through every other part of her, through her feet and her legs and her chest and her throat, through the particular truth that what we feel in our bodies is sometimes the most honest version of what is real. The panel of judges awarded Ella the prize for most inspiring performance of the evening. But the moment that mattered most happened outside the auditorium afterward, when Logan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small, woven bracelet, simple, frayed at one end from years of handling. He held it out to Ella and told her it had belonged to Mia, and that Mia had believed music belonged to every heart that was willing to feel it. Ella looked at the bracelet in Logan's open hand for a long moment. Then she looked up at him and signed, slowly and clearly, "Keep it." Mia was already here today. In the months that followed, the school established a sign language club. Charlotte redesigned the arts program to include signed accompaniment for all major performances, hiring a certified interpreter for large events, and training student volunteers for smaller ones. Madison became one of the most committed members of the sign language club, attending every session and eventually helping to teach the basic vocabulary to younger students who expressed interest. She was not forgiven all at once. Forgiveness is not, generally, a thing that happens all at once, but she earned it in the way Ella had specified, through action and consistency, and the slow replacement of careless habits with careful ones. David and Ella began studying sign language together every evening after dinner. They used a workbook and a series of videos and a great deal of patient repetition, and they argued in the way that parents and children argue about the right way to do difficult things, and they laughed a great deal at the errors. And gradually, the language became part of the household, in the way that all languages become part of households, not as a special accommodation, but simply as one of the ways the people who lived there spoke to each other. Logan did not seal himself off again. He went to the hospital and collected the box of Mia's belongings and sat with it for a long time before opening it. And when he opened it, he found the drawing and the journal and the bracelet and a few other things, and he held each one for as long as he needed to, and he allowed himself to understand that the grief and the love were not two separate things that could be divided from each other. Mia was gone. He had loved her completely. Both of those things were true at the same time, and there was no amount of silence that would resolve the tension between them, only the willingness to keep living in it. In the spring, the school held a small concert in the gymnasium. Ella stood on the riser in a yellow dress she had chosen herself, and before the first song she turned to face the audience and raised her hands and signed to them all, slowly and simply, "Do not laugh when someone is different from you. They may simply be hearing the world in a different way." In the third row, Logan sat beside David. He watched Ella's hands move through the words, and he understood something that had been forming in him since the afternoon he had stood up in a middle school auditorium and raised his hands without thinking. He understood that grief and love speak the same language, and that language does not stop being alive just because the person you first learned it for is no longer there to hear it. The song began. Ella sang. Logan signed along from habit, quietly, just for himself, the words moving through his hands the way all the best things move through us, not as performance, but as the body's honest record of what it has loved. David, following the chorus from memory, made a small error in a sign and caught Ella's eye from the third row. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She shook her head in the small, fond way of a child who has long since accepted the particular kind of endearing foolishness of her parent. She kept singing. David corrected the sign and tried again, and this time he got it right, and the hall was full of hands raised quietly in the darkness, and the floor moved under everyone's feet, and nobody in that room needed to hear it clearly to know that something true was happening.